pornography you also analyze through, the evolution of feminist critiques of pornography, and also just in your conversations with your students as well. Because I think this works well with what you were talking about sex positivity and feminism in the 1970s and 80s. We have to update it now, right? Because feminism in the 70s and 80s was also blanketly, porn is patriarchy. Porn is degrading to women. It's wrong, etc. And I think now feminists, intersectional, not just white feminists, have a positive and different view of sex work that is a marked shift from that perception in perspective, I should say, from the 70s and 80s. So do you mind taking us a little through that mini history and that evolution as well, and how pornography can be viewed in 2022 through a feminist lens, or how you view it as well?
Yeah. Okay.
It's a broad question, I understand.
So you're absolutely right that for especially American feminists, but to a lesser extent British and Australian feminists in the mid 1970s onward, they came to see pornography as the kind of like linchpin of patriarchy. They saw pornographic representation as the training ground for men's subjugation and abuse of women outside of pornography and outside of the bedroom as well. So they, for example, drew a strong connection between sexual harassment in the workplace or unfair, unequal wages and pornography. It was pretty implausible then as an account of what was going on, because pornography then there wasn't an internet. You had to go into a store and go get a top shelf magazine, or you had to go to a blue CD theater. It just didn't have anything like the kind of ubiquitous role that it has now. But what's interesting is to revisit those debates now when pornography really is pretty ubiquitous, and where young people do have I say really ubiquitous. I think it's always important to remember that only about 50% of the world's population is online. So we're never actually talking. That's an important thing to remember. But I think arguably it's the case that young people now are much more formed by pornography than they used to be historically. Certainly when I talk to my students, they feel that the sexual script available to them was very much one written by porn. But I should say it's mainstream porn that they're talking about, because there's a huge amount of queer, independent, feminist porn that does not recycle very narrow, boring tropes of just male domination, female submission. The thing is, most of that porn isn't free. It's certainly not available on something like Pornhub. The story about 21st century pornography is a story about capitalism. It's about the domination of the internet by basically one company that has a monopoly and that uses mostly stolen content, right, to drive its traffic, has a very powerful algorithm whose function it is to bring different people's desires into conformity with each other. So if you write threesome, you're only going to get one kind of threesome, right? There's only going to be one distribution of the genders. And it's also really important to note that the existence of something like Pornhub has directly driven down the income of the women who work in porn, and it has also accelerated the rate at which they have to progress to more intensive, hardcore sex acts. So when we talk about 21st century porn, I think it's very important to name what kind of pornography worries us, and what sort of pornography might be more promising or liberatory or emancipatory. The one lesson we must learn from the 70s and 80s is not to try and look to the coercive power of the state to address any of these issues.
Yeah.
So, in the feminists in the mid 1970s onwards, famous for drafting forms of legislation that didn't try to criminalize porn, but did try and make it subject to civil litigation. Hugely well-intentioned, really bad idea in practice. The reasoning that Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon put forward behind their ordinances was taken up wholesale by the Canadian Supreme Court, who made this decision, this very important decision called Butler, that said that pornography, sorry, what exactly did it say? It said that that ruled out that said certain forms of pornography constituted criminal obscenity, right? Okay. And then within a few months, what happens is Canada's first gay and lesbian bookshop, Glad Day Bookshop, is found guilty of criminal obscenity. Because that's what the state does when you give them these laws. It doesn't go after the mainstream big porn giant. It goes after the queers and the gays and trans people. And so whatever we think we need to do or we don't need to do about porn, reaching to the carceral state is not the answer.
100%. And when you talked about how Pornhub steals content, it's like this, I guess, monopoly on pornography. What is your take on OnlyFans as a it's a fairly recent phenomenon and as a response to it? Because my understanding is that you cannot repost OnlyFans content. It is say you're to record it and put it on another website, you're violating their terms or potentially the law. I don't really know. This is a kind of I'm figuring it out as I'm talking about it. But at the same time, that really just applies to the company of OnlyFans, right? Yeah. Not the individual creators. So that's the sex workers working on OnlyFans. They are not owning their own material. It protects OnlyFans, even though in theory it sounds like a less exploitative practice versus Pornhub.
Yeah, so I think that's exactly the right diagnosis. So I think OnlyFans better on the whole than something like Pornhub, in part because sex workers, a lot of people who would practice in-person sex work, forms of, what's called prostitution, moved on to OnlyFans, and that often, not always, is physically safer. But of course, the problem with OnlyFans is that it's not owned by sex workers. What you want is an OnlyFans that is run by a sex workers cooperative, right? But you need big servers, right? And your server can never go down. Disaster. You need a huge amount of startup capital. Who has that kind of money available? Are sex workers, is a cooperative of sex workers going to be able to call on that startup capital? Absolutely not. I shouldn't say absolutely not. I'm optimistic. Sex workers and sex worker cooperatives are some of the most politically imaginative and organizationally astute people I've come across. And so if anyone was going to do it, I think sex workers would. So OnlyFans ambivalent, and sex workers are precarious on OnlyFans, right? Think about what happened when the major credit card companies started saying that sex workers had to get off. Think about forms of legislation. I mean, there's a piece of legislation in California right now moving through the legislative process, trying to get sex workers off OnlyFans. So there isn't fundamental security unless workers own the means of production.
100%. It was interesting too how OnlyFans, in order to appease their investors, they were like, we're going to ban sex work, and then they faced so much pressure and they had to reverse it. And you just have to imagine that you would never have that issue if this was a cooperative and it was actually owned by the workers putting in the labor on OnlyFans.